I'm Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of this second series of video programs on postgraduate research and supervision. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate research and supervision held at the Pan Pacific Hotel on the Queensland Gold Coast in September 1993. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve their postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
I've called this talk this morning, How to be a Better Supervisor, and I'm concentrating primarily on trying to avoid communication breakdown. This is rampant amongst student-supervisor pairs. We've just heard about more than one-to-one supervision model, about joint supervision and perhaps even multiplicity of supervisors where you have a supervisory panel. But this problem of communication exists regardless of the model. I'll be talking primarily about the one-to-one model, but I'd like to preface it by saying that if there is more than one supervisor, it's absolutely vital that the communication is between all the participants, so that if there are two supervisors, there's three-way communication, not between the student and one supervisor and the student and the other supervisor, but between all three of them, and also between the two supervisors themselves, and the same for any panel that we're talking about. I'll give some examples first of communication breakdown that I've come across in my research, and then I'll talk slightly more broadly about other kinds of communication breakdown and the importance of making things explicit, even if you assume that there's no need to make them explicit. The main message you can take away from this talk is don't assume that anything is understood. All these slides I'm going to show you now come from student and supervisor pairs talking to me in confidential interviews on the same topic, knowing that I'm not going to give either of them any feedback, so that the student had a chat with me and said something, and then I spoke to the supervisor, who equally had a chat and said something about the various topics we were talking about, and I then compared them. And in this first one, we see that the student is actually quite happy. It's the supervisor that isn't happy. The problem, of course, is that the supervisor doesn't tell the student that he would be a complete flop and he's being spoon-fed, and that he really feels quite irritated at the amount of effort he's having to put into this particular student. And it was only at the very end of his period of research, when he had great difficulty in getting his PhD. He was offered an MPhil and refused it, and in the end spent a very long time rewriting and redoing, that he realized that he hadn't really become an autonomous researcher, which is what this is all about. And it seems to me that the supervisor should have said some of the things he was saying to me in the interview directly to the student, so that rather than going along leaning very heavily on the supervisor, he would have been told by the supervisor that he had to try and do some of this on his own. Now we've got the other situation in the next slide, where the supervisor is happy but the student isn't. And in fact, this supervisor said to me that he really was probably one of the best supervisors students he'd ever had, and he'd been supervising for about 25 years. However, the student was very frustrated, and although he ended up with a good PhD in reasonably good time and got a job in the department in which he worked, he avoided the professor who had been his supervisor, and the professor never understood why. The student really believed that he had never had adequate supervision, but he never told the supervisor how unhappy he was, and the supervisor really thought that as the student was doing so well, he didn't want to interfere, he didn't want to push him in any way or to make him feel unsure of himself. And so as long as the student progressed well, he stood back and did very little. And the kind of thing that happened, that the student said he doesn't read what I write, was that the strategy that the supervisor adopted, which seemed to me to be a reasonable strategy for dealing with things that the student gave him, wasn't told to the student. So, for example, the student would give him a piece of writing, say 6 weeks before a tutorial meeting, and the professor would read it, think about it, be concerned that some parts of it went off at tangents that would delay the research if he were to follow them up, and could be seen as relatively irrelevant. But there was a core there that was quite exciting and could be explored and developed. And he didn't want to make this student feel in any way demoralized or unconfident, because he was such a good self-starting student. So he decided that the best thing to do was not to give him any negative criticism, but to focus on the part that he thought was worthy of development, and encourage him to work on that and talk about that and get him excited about that, so that all he got was positive feedback, which is a fair enough strategy if the student's aware that that's what's going on. But what the student thought happened was that this writing that he'd taken so long to do sat at the bottom of the supervisor's work pile for the 6 weeks that he'd had it. About half an hour before the meeting, the supervisor thought, oh my goodness, he gave me something, where is it? Had a quick look at it. One paragraph jumped out at him, so he spoke about this paragraph the whole time in the hope that the student would think that he'd read it all and wasn't aware that he hadn't. So that was a kind of misunderstanding. The student never challenged him. The supervisor never explained, this is what I'm going to be doing with your work. And we get this kind of result. And the department split later on because the new lecturer would have nothing to do with the head of department, and it caused great many problems for the staff working there. This one I found rather puzzling, because the student was complaining of claustrophobia, of a lack of trust from his supervisor, from being asked all the time what he was doing, how he was getting on, what results he had to report. But when I interviewed the supervisor, he was very embarrassed about the time that he gave the student, and it took quite a while for him to say this, about once a month. And so while he was hesitating, I thought he was actually going to come out and say it's about twice a day, and I didn't know how he possibly could afford that amount of time for this one student, because I knew he had several other students too. And when he finally said about once a month, he also said, but I intend to do better next term, and I'm going to try and increase that. I couldn't understand what was going on. But what was happening here, this was a science department, and the student was working in the same laboratory as the supervisor, and the supervisor didn't want the student to feel that he was working on something that was of no interest to anybody, that people had forgotten he was there. So whenever he was in that part of the lab, he'd just stop and have a quick chat with him, just a few words, usually saying, how's it going, any results yet? And the student counted that as supervision, where the supervisor only counted the formal tutorials in his study when they spoke only about how the work for the thesis was progressing, as opposed to the day-to-day work he was doing in the laboratory, not all of which was directly concerned with the work he was doing for his thesis. The professor counted that as supervision. But once again, this misunderstanding wasn't discussed, nothing was made explicit. The kind of arrangement that I recommend, where a student and supervisor at the very beginning discuss how often they should see each other, when the next meeting should be, and arrange at each tutorial when they should next have a tutorial meeting. That kind of relationship hadn't been established. The process wasn't discussed, and therefore we get this kind of ambiguity in what constitutes supervision, and the result that you see in front of you there. Here we've got a rather frustrated student and a supervisor who's aware that there's something wrong, but he hasn't asked him why he's feeling depressed or what's going wrong with his work. They don't discuss that. And I can't recommend strongly enough the importance of talking about the process of the research as well as the progress of the research. And one of the ground rules to be established when a student and supervisor first agree to work together is that the process will form part of the ongoing conversation. And once you actually open that up, then a lot of these topics will come out automatically, because during a tutorial discussion, you can talk about the work, but either the student or the supervisor, and there's a lot of responsibility on both. It isn't all one-sided. Nevertheless, the supervisor is the one with the experience. And although it's not easy to talk personally about our relationship, if it's on the agenda, it's something that can be reached as you move through the tutorial discussion, and it will avoid later problems where you have people who want to change their supervisors or who disappear completely and avoid meeting with their supervisor at all. So putting process on the agenda from the word go will make a lot of difference. And then the final one of these paired comments is after the student had completed and he was feeling okay, and said, looking back, he thought that probably that was the way to do it because he had been successful, and the supervisor thought that he'd put in quite a lot of effort with this particular student, but that was his job as a supervisor after all. So here we have a happy ending, but it wasn't happy all the way through, and the student only thought retrospectively that perhaps that was the way to do it, for it to work. And in fact, this student, who had been quite unhappy during quite a large period of the time that he was a research worker, said to me when he got an appointment at a university that now that he was going to be having research students of his own, he was actually going to do the same, treat his students the same as he had been treated. And I said, well, I'm really surprised at that, because you were so unhappy and you wanted to give up so many times. How can you inflict that on other people? And he said, well, I don't want to be responsible for not giving them any of the experiences that are necessary for them to be successful. And as he'd been successful, he thought that the best model for success was the model that he'd received. So there is a danger there. This was some years ago, before we were able to talk so openly about supervision. When I started this and I asked people, quite experienced supervisors and academics who had very successful completed students who were doctors, who were even professors, and I asked them to conceptualize their role as supervisor as opposed to their role as university academic, and they didn't understand the question in those days. So we've come quite a long way, even though we've still got quite a long way to go. That's the end of my paired comparisons. And now I want to go rather more generally and talk about some of the things that should be brought into the discussion and made explicit and opened up for communication in order for these kind of misunderstandings not to occur. And the first topic I want to talk about is originality, because the PhD is awarded for an original contribution to knowledge, but we don't really know what we mean when we talk about originality. Now, in that little book that you've been sent for this conference, I've set out something like 17 different definitions of originality that I've collected one way or another from students and from supervisors. So I won't go over them again, but that, I think, has shown that there are a whole range of different ways in which people might be interpreting originality, but they're not discussing it with each other. Another thing that came out of that research that I've written in that chapter is that there wasn't any kind of understanding that people were defining originality in a different way. Everybody just assumed originality is originality. I've gone a bit further now than the point I was at when I wrote that, because I set that up as a problem. What are we going to do about it? But having thought about it for a while now, I actually think that it isn't so much a problem as an escape avenue for students, because students are very, very worried about their work being original enough. And it seems to me that if we can say that there are at least 17 different ways in which their work can be said to be original, maybe they'll realize that it's much easier to be original than they think at the moment. So I would suggest that as supervisors, you actually have a discussion about the concept of originality quite early with your students, because it's something that hasn't been discussed. And students worry about it, and it only gets discussed very late on. But you can set their mind at rest and talk about various ways in which they might be able to be original, so that they're not having sleepless nights over it. Also, I discovered that students think that they have to be enormously original. They have to take a 7-league stride, and they have to completely recreate everything, almost. While supervisors know that it's a very small step that's sufficient, some kind of increment to what's been done before. And students only discover this very far into their research, maybe the 3rd year. And they don't ever talk about it. When they spoke to me about it in my research, they said that they'd been worrying about it, and they might have spoken about it to other research students, but they never speak about it to members of staff. So as members of staff, I'm saying that this is something that really bothers students. We have very little communication about it at the moment, and I would like to see it brought into the arena, opened up, made explicit, introduced by the supervisor, so that the student can either state the problems they're having or not get into those problems, because it's all discussed at a very early stage. And they have to be told, in addition to the many ways in which it's possible to be original, and to find out from them what they think originality means. Also, that it doesn't have to be anything nearly as big as they think it has to be. Another thing that I spoke to them about was what they thought they were doing when they were doing a PhD, because people don't talk about that either. And the supervisor said that the PhD is partly a piece of research and partly an examination, and very quickly spoke about the thesis and the PhD synonymously, as though they were one and the same. So I went on to explore with the supervisors what they thought the thesis was, since they couldn't really separate them out very easily. And they said that in the thesis there should be these 3 key elements, which you've got up in front of you, and that the design, thought, and explanation all have to be well done. I asked them if they spoke to their students about this, and they didn't, because these were just things that were taken for granted. And when I spoke to the students, they had great difficulty in separating out the PhD from the thesis, so we spoke about the thesis rather than the PhD. And they said that despite the things that they thought to do with methodology and the way it had to be expressed, etc., they felt that there was a great deal of limitation on their freedom to express themselves in the way they wanted. And this was because no matter what subject area they were working in, they were convinced that theirs was one of the only theses ever that wouldn't fit into the kind of structure either laid down by the university or that they thought they should be following, because sometimes they're not at all clear, and supervisors haven't discussed it with them. So once again, we have this area that isn't discussed as often or as early as it should be, and students feeling very constrained. However, we find that the students are talking about this lack of freedom as lots of different areas which have to be forced into one section, but the supervisors are saying that a successful thesis means making a string of sausages into a small salami. And I like that analogy very much. But it seems to me that they're actually saying the same thing, except that the students are seeing it negatively while the supervisors are seeing it positively. That the students are having great difficulty in discarding any of this enormously valuable data and information and background reading they've been doing over the years in order to pull it into the shape of a coherent, well-constructed thesis that hangs together and follows a line of argument and tells a story. While the supervisors in this statement that I've selected out of the various things they said to describe this process, are saying that when the student is able to do that, then the student is successful and has got the hang of and the idea of what is required for a successful, well-constructed thesis. Well, once again, it's necessary to have these kind of discussions with the students, and to allow them to express their hesitations and their concerns, and for the supervisors to feel this inhibition of freedom that the students complain about, in order to begin to work with them into making the string of sausages into a salami. The main message is communicate about things that you might not have felt it necessary to communicate about.
Estelle, were there any, with the sample that you take there, was it across a range of ages with these students? It seems that, just from the way that they've been expressed, that a lot of them may have been younger students.
In the paired comparisons, I only had, I think, 2 of those examples were people who were called mature students, but even the mature students were quite young. They had had a few years out working professionally and then come back to do their PhD, but they were still in their 20s, their late 20s. I didn't have anybody older than that, although now I work primarily with people who are considerably older than that.
I'm referring to those paired reports also, Estelle. Were they all male, or was there a mixture of female and male? Do you have any record of that?
Yes, in my research, I had a small minority of female students. This is the paired comparisons come from some of my earlier research, and I did have a few female students, but I don't think any of those communication breakdown examples, none of those come from the female student. They were all male-male. That doesn't mean to say that the female supervisors or the female students never had communication breakdown. It's just they're not in the sample I showed you.